Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Bresnahan. I'm the marketing manager here at CyberSaint. Welcome to today's webinar, How to React When a Competitor is Hit by Ransomware. Today, I'm joined by CyberSaint Senior Customer Advisor Haley Pruitt and Carmen Garibi, a director at the Security and Risk Group of 1898 & Co. As always, feel free to submit questions throughout our discussion today. And with that, why don't we kind of kick things off with a bit of intros? Why don't we start with you, Carmen?
Hi, thanks, Ethan. And thanks, everybody. My name is Carmen Garibi. As Ethan said, I'm director of the cybersecurity team at 1898 & Co. We support the critical infrastructure customers to become cyber resilient and obtain situational awareness for their critical operations and systems. I'm based in Houston, Texas, and super excited to have this conversation with you all.
All right, so hey everybody. As Ethan said, I am the Senior Customer Advisor at CyberSaint. Right now I focus primarily on customer success and helping design platform customizations and scoping out integrations, but coming to you with a background in consulting, where I worked mostly on IT risk management and cyber wargaming engagements. So I've worked with just about every industry that's out there, so I've seen a lot of simulated and real responses to attacks, so I'm excited to talk to you guys a little bit about that today.
Awesome. So we'll go ahead and kick things off. We have a few slides to share here. So obviously, you know, the impetus for this conversation today is definitely a lot of the attacks that we've seen historically or in recent months, especially with Colonial and JBS, and kind of getting to think about the impact that those attacks have not just on the companies themselves, but on their competitors. Sort of what is the impact on the industry at large? So to kind of kick things off, Carmen, we'll start with you. Can we kind of begin by covering how CISOs have historically handled sort of an attack within their sector, but not necessarily an attack on them?
Right.
How have you seen CISOs respond to that first 24 hours after news of an attack breaks?
Yeah, gosh, you know, within the first 24 hours, for the folks that do get hit, it's very much crisis mode, right? And sort of deployment of the crisis management. And their focus certainly is to contain and isolate the attack. But for the rest of the folks who are sort of their peers in that industry, they are really sort of watching and waiting and sort of have this, you know, let's sort of get through this and wait and see and have some reactive conversations with their leadership and their board. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity to change that. I know, Haley, you'll talk about a little bit about that. But what happens right now is that there's a lot of sort of using some pre-existing knowledge of this sort of security posture, the existing security posture that they have, and sort of saying, well, we're going to continue down this path. We know what we're doing. We don't know what happened. Let's wait and see. So it's a lot of sort of standing by, waiting to see what information comes out. But there could be a lot more that can be done during this time. So there's not a whole lot of support that peers are offering the organizations that are getting attacked at the moment.
Right. And so with that in mind, especially kind of that reactive, just kind of get through it, head down, not necessarily that sort of that reactive approach, especially with the unprecedented rise in attacks that we've seen in the last 18 months, as well as the complexity. Haley, can you kind of touch on sort of what the first 24 hours should look like?
Sure. So I think it's important to first remember that following an attack, while the rest of us kind of get to sit back, relax, and watch the situation unfold, knowing that we have little to risk, other companies within the sector, and even sometimes outside the affected sector, they don't have that same luxury. You know, there's a lot behind the scenes that organizations can and should be doing to either detect or prevent a similar event from happening to them. So I like to bucket these things that they can do into an easy to remember acronym. So I came up with this one. It's called OUCH, because I think that's what I imagine CISOs would be saying if they don't perform these activities. So the first letter is O for observe. like us, CISOs, they're watching the news, they're reading security blogs, scanning forums from the information sharing organizations that they're a part of, really exploring whatever avenues they have available to them, trying to figure out what's happened. How did the hackers get in? What vulnerability was exploited? How did the hackers move throughout the network? What did they take or change? But I think their goal for gathering that information is a bit different than ours. While we're trying to figure out who should be held responsible or who we can blame and tweet our anger at, CISOs are trying to figure out what they should be looking for within their own environments to ensure that they haven't also been infiltrated and that their systems are protected. So once they have a better idea of what they should be looking for, that brings us to you, which is understand. I think stakeholders from the C-suite, the board, and the public, they're all going to be wanting reassurance that what happened to the victim company hasn't and won't happen to their company. They're going to be asking their CISO questions about the company's current cyber posture. Which systems are at risk? What are the gaps? Why are there gaps? What's the impact if XYZ were to happen? How do you prevent that from happening? The list goes on. But as most of us know, understanding and getting an accurate picture of that isn't easy. Most companies today are still identifying and tracking gaps via spreadsheets on more of an annual basis. It's a point in time checkbox compliance activity that they're required to do. But in crisis situations, those outdated spreadsheets can only result in really one of two things. For those who are more trusting, it may create a false sense of security that their systems are more secure than they really are. Or for those that are less trusting, it may create a lack of confidence that systems are still as secure now as they were when the assessment was last conducted. Neither of which are a good thing when you're dealing with a cyber attack. So in all likelihood, figuring out your cyber posture may be an activity that started within the first 24 hours. But for most companies, it's not going to be an activity that they complete until several weeks, maybe even months later, unless they have the tools that give them real-time visibility. This is an activity that requires a lot of coordination with different teams. You've got various technical teams that are checking monitoring tools, sifting through logs, looking at configuration settings, reviewing scans. And, depending on the size of your network and whether you already know which assets you need to be looking at, this could take some time. So, the more fortunate CISOs who have a good understanding of their assets and have started to employ tools like integrated risk management platforms that continuously track gaps over time, they're going to have a much easier time providing that reassurance to those stakeholders because they can back up the claims that they make. So, once they then understand, what's the current state of their environment, they actually have to start answering some of those questions that I listed out, which brings us to C, communicate. Communication it's really the only way to create a common operating picture and make sure that all relevant parties are on the same page and speaking the same language. For most organizations, communication kind of starts at the top with the CEO. The CEO is the face of the company. They're the one that's expected to speak on behalf of the organization and answer the public's questions, even when it comes to topics like security, which in most cases probably isn't their forte. So when you think about who's helping write their script behind the scenes, you look to the CISO. So the CISO needs to be giving the CEO and really the rest of the C-suite as a whole a very transparent view of the company's security posture. They should be communicating things like whether or not they're seeing any activity that would suggest an attack, what their teams are doing to monitor the environment and detect attempts of an attack, where the current gaps are, their potential impacts and risks and the likelihood of exploitation, any unknowns, providing disclaimers for where they may not have visibility. Last but not least, what resources are required to remediate the gaps that they've identified, and what are the steps that they need to be taking to protect critical systems against future attacks. And I think most people would agree that if ever there was a time to argue your case for more money and people to bolster security, it's when an attack is at the forefront of everyone's minds. Mm-hmm. So, once the C-suite is clued in, communications then go down and out. The CISO should be, spearheading efforts to raise awareness among the broader staff of an organization as it relates to, good cyber hygiene. Things like not clicking on fishy emails, choosing strong passwords, not using a random USB found on the subway, things that usually serve as entry points for attackers. And then with communicating out, they should also be helping consolidate risk reports and sharing them with the board of directors on a regular basis so that they too feel confident in the direction the company's headed. And then with all of that communication, after that is when the heart of the work begins, which brings us to H, which is harden. So once they've identified their gaps, lobbied for the resources that they need, that's when they can actually start implementing the mitigating controls to close some of those gaps. And again, this is an activity that can be started within the first 24 hours, but it's likely going to take some time to complete. Hardening activities could range anywhere from, changing some configuration settings and updating documentation to deploying an entirely new endpoint protection tool. Most of those activities take more effort than there is time in a day. So all in all, even if an attack doesn't affect your company directly, there's still a lot that can and should be done. I think taking these steps and initiating them within the first 24 hours, will help organizations avoid a more painful experience further down the line.
Right, and I definitely think we'll be diving into a little bit more about sort of how to capitalize on that change management. I think right now, actually, thinking past a lot of that really great insight and sort of that proactivity. To your point, Haley, obviously, sort of the nature of being proactive, you can have sort of that proactivity within the first 24 hours. But as you said, getting proactive, it's better to do that. Better to get on that sooner rather than later, especially when it comes to synthesizing your posture information and sort of being able to communicate that to the CEO and in turn to the board. Having that on hand rather than trying to stitch that all together from spreadsheets is definitely not probably not even possible. So, moving past the initial crisis management, the first 24 hours, from an operational standpoint, Carmen, how can CISOs and business leaders leverage an attack within their sector to increase and the subsequent just general security awareness within their organization? And sort of what change can they leverage at the practitioner and sort of lower and people levels of the company?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when there is an attack, whether it happens to you or happens to one of your peer organizations, it really erodes trust across that sector, across that segment. And so there ought to be an opportunity, it presents an opportunity to sort of have that introspection, right? And to say, hey, there's opportunity, not just for the organization that got attacked, but for us, the folks that didn't, to take an opportunity to learn, right? And once you've taken that opportunity to learn, it presents an opportunity for investments. So it's a great time to ask for budget. And I know that may sound a little callous, and I certainly don't mean to come across that way, but we have to, the only way to change and improve our cybersecurity posture is with investments. And so one of the things that I should definitely caution is that there shouldn't be sort of this rush for a technology, right? I think technology is good. I'm all for it, but it doesn't immediately solve the problem. And I liked your question, Ethan, because it really is about the heart of the operations. And so the way that we recommend sort of taking opportunity or sort of leveraging that opportunity from a cyber attack that happened to somebody else is to really look inward and look at your organization's people, process, and technology. So what are the gaps that I have within people? What are the training that I'm providing to my staff, to my operations folks that can help them identify a cyber intrusion or prevent a cyber intrusion, making sure they're not clicking on any suspicious links, right? Because the cyber attacks of yesterday are not going to be the same attacks of tomorrow. It's an evolving landscape, so the attacks look different. So we need to equip our folks, our operations, to be able to identify that. And then looking at process, right? What investments do I have to make in my process? Do I need better authentication? Do I need a better endpoint protection? Do I need better password management, right? What are those processes and policies that I need to polish up and make better, again, to prevent a cyber attack? And then lastly is that technology, right? Once you've invested in your people, you invested in your process, now you can look at investing in technology, because technology isn't going to solve a training issue. Technology is going to enhance the good of the people and the good of the processes that you already have in place. And so as organizations start asking for budgets, which you should, make sure that it's also from a point of view of people, process, and technology. So, how do you leverage that opportunity? You definitely get in front of your board and you ask for some investment dollars.
Absolutely, and that's definitely something that we've harped on in webinars past, especially our solutions architect Steve certainly likes to talk about how technology is not the silver bullet that I think some security folks think it is. And to your point, Carmen, it really and to what Haley referenced earlier, as far as clicking on the phishing emails, finding a USB on the subway. It does start with the people, and it's the people process. It's the people in the process that need the most addressing, and it's the technology that can support it, not the other way around.
Yes, absolutely.
So from a higher level, Haley, with your experience in change management and sort of seeing these in both sort of simulations as well as in sort of real world, real time, how else can CISOs strike while the iron's hot, so to speak, and leverage awareness on the importance of cybersecurity at sort of the higher levels of the organization? As Carmen mentioned, leveraging that awareness at the board and executive leadership level to potentially secure more budget, get buy-in for projects, et cetera.
Yeah, so I think as Carmen talked about, it all comes back to a couple of key themes around communication, education, and budgeting. The goal is to, change cybersecurity from, a compliance activity to, more of a strategic initiative, and have that, strategic risk-aware culture that comes from the top down. And, while the rise in cyber attacks has shed a bit of light on how devastating cyber attacks can be, I think those in positions of power are still largely in the dark, especially if their teams on the ground aren't reporting up on what they're seeing and experiencing, which unfortunately is the case at many companies when there's not a crisis at hand that they're dealing with. No one communicates until something's wrong, and then the truth is typically embellished a little bit to keep people from getting in trouble. But it's that same lack of transparency that leads to false perceptions. If leadership has no insight into their vulnerabilities, attempted attacks on their company, or even the minor attacks that are successful, they're not going to have a good understanding of the risks that they face, and they may start to think that an attack either can't or won't happen to them. They get stuck in that mindset. Or, they might think that their systems are more secure than they actually are because they haven't been told otherwise. And those false perceptions become even more dangerous when it comes to allocating budget. Security isn't cheap, and that fact is not lost on leadership. So if they think that their environment is already well protected, they're more than likely not going to see the benefit in throwing more money towards it. So what ends up happening is resources and budget are diverted away from the important behind-the-scenes security initiatives towards more, high visibility projects with quote-unquote tangible benefits. But when a peer organization suffers from a cyber attack, CISOs have a really unique opportunity to leverage, sounds terrible, but that heightened fear and the attention leadership has around cyber to make a stronger case for allocating budget to their security initiatives. Rather than shielding leadership from the harsh reality that their environment has gaps, CISOs should be capitalizing on that fact and highlighting any similarities that they can between the victim company's environment and their own to demonstrate the severity of what could happen if those gaps and weaknesses were exploited. I kind of think of it as, would you change the oil in your car if the light never came on and told you that you needed to? I know that I wouldn't. And do I know that it's important and I'm supposed to? Sure. But if the car appears to be working fine, it's not a pressing concern for me. And that's because, one, I don't understand cars, and two, I don't know what the consequences would be if I didn't do it. But if I saw a car explode and I found out later it's because the oil was never changed and I knew I hadn't changed mine in quite some time, you better believe I'd be at the shop as soon as possible getting it taken care of so I don't go up in flames. So I think a lot of people treat cybersecurity the same way, but you don't want to wait for that fire. It's much better, and you're going to be more successful if you take a more proactive approach.
Right, and it definitely comes back to being candid with leadership about security posture. Right, as opposed to, the rose-colored glasses that you were talking about, where it's all, and nobody wants to deliver tough news, but at the same time, in that first 24 hours, being candid and not necessarily even admitting, but being candid about where the gaps in your security posture are. Number one, knowing where they are, but number two, articulating them in a way that executive leadership and the board can understand is that engine light, right? Where it becomes all the more important to have all of those things having all of those things on hand and being prepared to reflect them such that, and having an open dialogue with the board potentially in advance of this so that it doesn't come as a shock of, saying, hey, these are, we've had these gaps. They haven't been a priority until now, but they need to be in light of current developments.
Right. To the extent that you could minimize surprises during those kind of times, you want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, we've covered a lot here in the context of how CISOs can leverage an attack on their sector in sort of internally, right, to enhance security within their organization and sort of catalyze conversations both down the chain as well as up. That said, Carmen, from a publicly facing perspective, can you give us some things that security leaders should bear in mind as a result, and definitely think about in the wake of an attack, and definitely shouldn't, and some of them maybe they shouldn't do following an attack on a competitor?
Yeah, I like that question because there's I think that there's both Haley and I think shared a lot of things of what you should do, what happens, etc. But then there's sort of this bucket of information of what you shouldn't do, right? And I go back to what I mentioned earlier that, the trust recedes for the entire segment, right? So sort of this idea of the tide rises or sinks all boats. So it behooves us, and if you're in the same industry as the organization that got hacked, to actually come from a point of view of empathy, right? To not take a position of, it wouldn't happen to us because they're different. They didn't have X, Y, Z in place, but we do. So we're fine, right? I think that is a very dangerous thing to say because it doesn't come from a place of learning. And everybody knows that cyber threats are evolving. Nothing looks the same, right? It could have similar signatures, but it doesn't look the same. And so to take sort of a position of, well, we have ABC and we're fine, it's not going to happen to us, I think is very, very dangerous. So definitely avoid that. But because, it presents an opportunity of learning. And I think learning happens when there's a willingness to share. So if a similar organization comes from a point of view of, hey, what can help me understand? What can we help you with? Help me understand what happened. There's a willingness from the other party to share. And as you see now with the current administration sort of driving this volunteer intelligence sharing, information sharing across private and public industry, it's going to take that. It's going to take empathy from peers in the industry to sort of kind of suspend all previous beliefs and have an ability and a willingness to learn from it, offer help. And I think that will encourage the sharing, that information intelligence sharing from the folks that did face it, because it could be any of us, right? Any of us could have been in that seat. Any of us could have been Colonial Pipeline or JBS or anybody. It just so happened that it was them because there's very similar gaps and vulnerability points, and it just so happened to be them, right? They were the ones that were targeted. And so definitely stay away from that mentality of it couldn't happen to us because we're different, because we're not, and really focus on encouraging the trust building across the industry. So listen and share. That's what I would offer.
I think those are some great insights. If you think about the number of attacks that are thwarted every day within each individual company, probably runs in the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands for some larger companies and sort of the higher target industries. And it's not those that get publicized. It's not the wins, the losses. It, especially like this time around, it wasn't you, but maybe it is you next time. Haley, anything to add here?
Yeah, so I think Carmen made a lot of really good points. When it comes to cyber attacks, there's a tired but true saying. If it's not a matter of if, it's when. It may not have been your company this time, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't or that it won't be in the future. Another saying that comes to mind is if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. That's something that's drilled into us from a young age. But, in that same breath, I don't think that companies should be completely silent. As Carmen said, information sharing during times of crisis is critical. When I look at cyber attacks, it seems to me, how much you spend really depends on the efficiency and effectiveness of your response. And I think companies as a whole would be more equipped to respond to, incidents like, say, WannaCry, where several companies within a single industry or even across industries were affected. If they worked together and shared information more openly, they would have been more successful in responding to that. I think people are starting to recognize cybersecurity as a company-wide responsibility, and they're adopting that more top-down, risk-aware culture. But in my mind, cybersecurity should really be a cross-industry community responsibility. The fear of being persecuted by the public or fined by the government or retargeted by other attackers has historically kept organizations from speaking openly about the attacks that they've suffered. But when an attack happens, I think that fear, needs to be set aside for the greater good. Victim companies should be more open to communicating the strengths and weaknesses of their response, talking about what worked and what didn't. And, rather than taking a back seat and taking comfort in knowing that the spotlight isn't on them, leaders of unaffected companies should be adopting the lessons learned from their peers and thinking about what their own response would look like so that when their day comes, because eventually it will, they'll be prepared. A lot of times, hackers try the same method of attack on several different targets before they actually strike success. So, imagine how many attacks could be prevented or at least detected earlier if companies who are, more equipped, they're the well-protected ones that are more mature in their security journey, if they reported, attacks that have been attempted on their company and warned those who are less secure, or if they, provided guidance on easy steps that could be taken to secure targeted systems based on the attacks that they've experienced, or, told others what to look for so that they could more quickly determine whether or not they've been attacked in a similar way. If that happened, the fallout from attacks could maybe be reduced. And I think when it comes to speaking publicly on an incident, it's best that non-victim companies kind of reserve their judgment, because one day it will be them, and instead use their platform to raise awareness around things like the inevitability of attacks. The challenges that all organizations face, most likely due to the increasing size and complexity of their technical infrastructures. I don't think anybody really grasps that concept sometimes. They could be using their platform to talk about, cybersecurity best practices, and most importantly, simply setting reasonable expectations around timelines for understanding how an attack happened and what was impacted. Attacks, as Carmen said, they're always going to be a given. There are a lot of unknowns within the first 24 hours, but preparing for that, communicating openly, and employing tools that increase visibility into your environment, those are all major pillars for success that shouldn't be overlooked.